So how did I get into gaming? Welcome to another life story video that might get a little bit depressing and take a while, but if you're into that sort of thing, here we go. So, also, if you're new here, please do subscribe and all that sort of thing, because, silver play button on the way one day, you never know. Anyway, I'm 26 years old, and I'm pretty sure that I've been gaming for as long as I've been physically capable of holding a controller. My oldest gaming memories, the two games that I am pretty sure, one of them was the first game that I ever played, was Resident Evil 3 for the PlayStation 1, or Shrek Treasure Hunt for the PlayStation 1. Two very, very different games there, I am certain. Although, either one of them chasing you down a dark alley at night, I'm not sure who's a little bit scarier. Now, when I was younger, I spent an ungodly amount of time gaming. To be fair, I don't think that really ever changed. The only time that I don't spend ages gaming these days is periods like right now, where I'm so heavily focused on making videos for all the different social medias. Like every so often, the business side of things takes over for a while, and the gaming side of things has to be pulled down a smidge. But then once whatever the new thing is, once that's been built to a point where it's semi self-sustaining, then I can play more. Because while gaming is one part of the business, it's also one of the smaller parts of the business comparatively. So again, I've always been very transparent about numbers for you guys. Playing games will bring in decent money as long as you can get decent views, for sure. But you require several times as many views on those gaming videos to make the same amount of money versus some of the other types of content that I make, for example. So right now I'm getting big into like content creation when it comes to doing what I do as a job, making money online. And yeah, anyway, I've always been just the world's sweatiest gamer, and the reason for that, and this is where it gets a little bit depressing, and why I've got you on the tripod, because we're going to be here a while just talking about this sort of thing, is I grew up in a household that was not most conducive to a happy childhood, as it were. I've mentioned bits and pieces about this before, but I had not a very nice man for a dad. He was an alcoholic. He would spend several days a week at the pub. Specifically, I would always remember Wednesday, he would go missing. He would usually, I think he'd find his own way to the pub, and we'd fairly often have to go and pick him up in the middle of the night. And realistically, it's strange, right? I never realised how abnormal my childhood was until I became an adult and started meeting people that are actually well-adjusted. Because when I was a teenager, none of my friends had dads either. So I just thought this stuff was normal. I grew up in a council house. Well, it was a council house because of the fact that my mom had to sell it back to the council because she couldn't afford it as a single parent once my dad eventually did run away. I'm getting way ahead of myself there because that happened when I was like 13. So when it comes to like my childhood life, I had to barricade myself in my bedroom often. Cayle, your dad's drunk, put something in front of the door was something I heard a few times a week. I would have to like drag a desk or something like that to barricade my door because my dad would come home so drunk that he wouldn't realise which door led to the toilet, and he would just walk into my room and piss on the floor. That is the sort of life that I lived. And I've got a million and one dad stories. Like I said, he was a pretty abusive alcoholic. He had a habit of running away from partners. Like, for example, I have got, it's an interesting one. I consider myself an only child when it comes to siblings. But in total, between my mum and my dad, I've got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, minimum 6 siblings. I am minimum one of 7. But I remember overhearing my mum talking about this once on the phone about how my dad may have had one by accident when he was like really young, outside of the ones that we actually know about. So I might be one of like 8, I don't know. But anyway, the reason I consider myself a bit of an only child in that aspect is the fact that my sisters on my mom's side, who I do know and I do speak to, well, it's been over a year since I've spoken to them, but like I do speak to them, like I know them. They are both in their 40s right now. So they had moved out and all that sort of thing by the time I was like sentient. If they're like 20 years older than me, ish, or nearly 20 years older than me, I don't think there was very much time where there was a crossover where they lived at home with me. For example, I can just about, of my 2 sisters on my mum's side, one of them is like 44, one of them is like 40 on the dot, I think. I think that's the age difference. The one that is 40 on the dot, I can just about remember a time where she lived at home. But the older one, I can't remember at all. People talk about like, will I ever have kids and stuff like that, and I don't want kids. My 2 sisters between them have got like 12 to 14 kids. I sort of lose track there as well because it's nuts. And my eldest nieces and nephews, some of them watch my videos, I'll tell that story in a bit. My eldest nieces and nephews are in their 20s. Like, I think I have 3 nieces and nephews. They're all in their 20s. One of them, he's properly settled down. He's got a partner, he's got a mortgage, he's got a good job. I'm willing to bet he has kids before me, and then I become a great uncle. I've been a great uncle since I was 3 years old. It's pretty. I've been an uncle since I was 3 years old. Anyway, so that's my mom's side. But then on my dad's side, so he potentially had a kid by accident when he was really young. But again, I've only ever heard rumour of that one. That is unconfirmed. But then I know for a fact that he had a wife before my mom who he had 2 kids with. I've never ever met them, except for once, kind of. When I turned 13, I woke up and my dad was gone. And when that happened, I was like, right, let's see if I can find my older siblings, because I've never been. It was a topic that we were not allowed to bring up because it would send my dad over the edge. My dad would fly off the handle if you mentioned the kids that he never sees, and therefore I was never allowed to speak about or see myself. I've, to this day, never met them, and well, I'm 26. Anyway, I found my older brother on time, at the time. When I was 13, I think he was about 18. I found him. I sent him a message being like, this is going to sound really weird, but I'm your younger brother, and my dad's just done the same thing to me that he did to you all those years ago, because he just has this habit of running away. My older brother told me to off myself in that message. So that was the last I ever heard of him, once I sent that screenshot to his fiancée, because petty dick. Anyway, never met the sister from that side either. So that's 2 siblings just straight away out the window. So because of that, I feel like I grew up an only child. And I wasn't exactly the most sociable, because I was also pretty fat. I didn't have very good social skills. I wasn't very good at speaking to people. I just didn't leave the house very often. Because of what my home life was like, I wasn't exactly a household that could frequently have friends round. Like, you know how you were either the friend that went to someone else's house or the house that friends came to. I was never able to be the house that friends came to until after my dad left, because it was just a no-go with him there, because you'd never know what was going on. I would never leave my room very frequently. Like, whenever I would see TV shows and like it'd be all dramatized and people would be like, go to your room, I'm like, that wouldn't be a problem for me. Like, I lived in my room. Tiny ass room, never left, but I had my consoles. So we grew up pretty poor, right? My mom was a carer, and she's told me, I've said this before a million times, the most she ever earned in a year was 20k, she told me. And my dad was, at the time, for the majority of the time, I think, a removals man. So he just drove lorries and lifted things, which I don't know how much they get paid, but I also can't assume that it's very much. So we didn't do very well. I'd never been abroad until I was an adult. The idea of a holiday to me when I was a kid was we went to Cornwall for a weekend. That's the sort of holiday we did, or a caravan or a tent or something like that. So we'd never really had much money or anything like that. They never had nice cars, nice house, nothing. But I did have my games, and the reason that I had my games was because of my nan. My nan knew what my home life was like and pretty much took pity. And again, because of my sisters being older, it was fairly well known that my nan was just like your typical granny that will never stop trying to give you money. It's one of these where if you didn't accept the money, she'd be upset, that sort of thing. My nan always told me that when my sisters were young, they got a ton of money from my nan and my granddad. My granddad died before I was born, so I never got a chance to meet him. But my nan always told me that when my sisters were my age at the time, when I was a kid, that they were spoilt by my nan and my granddad. So it's only fair that I also get stuff too. So while my mum and my dad couldn't exactly afford to get me the nice things, my nan always did try and get me the nice things. Whenever she could get me nice things, she'd always tell me if there's ever anything I want or anything like that, just to tell her, because she'll sort it out. But I wouldn't obviously do that because my mum would tell me not to. But like, if I mentioned that next month there was a game coming out or something like that, my nan would usually make that happen. So I didn't exactly have much, but I had my games. So I'd never leave the room, to the point where I would literally be... I remember at one point, imagine saying this as a grown man to your child. At one point, my dad said to me, "Why are you afraid of me?" Something like that. "Why don't you like me?" Something like that. And it's like, bro, as an adult now, oh Christ, I realised this the other day. I realised the other day that I am now older than my dad was when he had me, which is a crazy concept. But imagine being an adult man asking someone in their, like, I don't know how old I was when he asked me that, but again, just before I turned 13, he ran away and I never saw him again, kind of. So before he ran away, he asked me that, so I was under 13. It's like, bro, if you have to ask your child that, you in your parenting have messed up big time. So the fact that I never, if he was in the house, I would try and avoid him. And in a 2-bedroom house, avoiding your dad is not exactly easy to do. So I would avoid getting a drink. I would avoid going to the kitchen. I would avoid as much as I possibly could. Luckily, because of his job as a removals man, that usually meant that some amount of days per month he wasn't around, because he would often be a long haul removals man where he'd drive to Paris and stuff like that. I remember he was really, really into his fishing. He cared more about his fishing stuff than he ever did his family. I remember when he ran away, all he took was his fishing stuff. That was how we knew he was gone, and it wasn't just a he's disappeared for the day sort of thing, because he'd had a habit of disappearing before. It was he took all of his fishing stuff, and all of his money went on fishing stuff. He spent a fortune on it. So yeah, the reason that I got into gaming and how I was a lifelong gamer is because it was all I had, really. I didn't have friends to go out and see all the time. I didn't have a social life. I didn't have the holidays or many nice things outside of games. So I just took solace in my room where I was safe. I could barricade my door and I could play games all day, every day. And that's what I did for a very long time. So that's the short version of this story. But like, let's tell some other dad stories, because I have been asked them before. Like reasons why. So here's an interesting one, right? My mum, when my dad ran away, called me cold and heartless because I didn't care. At 13 years old, my dad ran away. The way that happened was I woke up, my mum wasn't there. This was very common. I was being left alone in the house from when I was 6 years old. And again, I didn't realise that was abnormal until I got older. To this day, my partner's younger brother is like 12 now. He still isn't ever left on his own in the house, and I think that's crazy, because I was 6 years old when I started being left alone in the house. It's why I think I grew up quick. This sort of childhood grows you up quick, I think, and it's why I think I've been able to sort of later in life, when it comes to business stuff, sort of be smart with things and set myself up earlier, because I had a mindset that is older than I'm supposed to be because of the childhood I had, and it sort of ingrained that in me. But like, I'd be left alone from like 6 years old pretty frequently. When below 6, I'd go to my sister's house. After 6, I started just being on my own. And I'd wake up, and it was a normal day. My mum wasn't there, my dad wasn't there. Cool. Went downstairs to get a drink. Now, in the kitchen of that old house, the door that led to the room, the little, I don't know what to call it. It's not even a room. It's like an understairs, like, storage space. There was a storage space in our kitchen behind a door. This door never worked. Never got fixed, never worked. This door was always permanently open. And I remember I went downstairs to get a drink, and I noticed all of his fishing stuff was gone. I didn't exactly think much of it, because at 12 years old, your perception of things in terms of critical thinking isn't brilliant. Like, it's not like I sat there and thought, his fishing stuff is gone, he's gone. He's never coming back. I didn't think that, but I was like, oh, his fishing stuff gone, that's weird. So I go upstairs, and then a few hours later, my mum gets home from work, and she's like, where's your dad? I'm like, I don't know. She realises all his fishing stuff is gone, and he's like, that's weird. She then looks for the clothes. He's taken all his clothes. Now it's like, what's going on? So from here on in, for the next like couple of weeks, all hell kicks off. He had emptied their joint bank account. He'd ran away. My mom attempted... He only had one place to run. We knew exactly where he was going. My mom, I think, attempted to throw a brick at him or something along those lines, because my mom ended up getting arrested, and it was my eldest sister who managed to like stop her actually committing a crime. And I just remember being sat in the car through all of this thinking, God, I hope they don't go out together. Because this was not the first time this had happened, or something along these lines had happened. Years prior to that, I have this one memory. It's interesting, right? Human psychology is an interesting one, because it's a fairly well-known concept that your memories are faulty. Whenever you remember something, I think you're supposed to be remembering the last time you remembered it, and therefore the further away from the event actually happening you get, and the more amount of times you remember that memory, the further from the truth it actually becomes. And sometimes I sit here and I think, have I made some of this up? Did all of this actually happen? But then my mum tells me stories, and my nan used to tell me stories, and my sisters talk about it, and all that sort of thing. And it reconfirms that no, it actually was this bad. Because sometimes I think, surely it couldn't have actually been this bad. Other people must have had it worse. Am I crying about this for no reason? That sort of thing. But like, I've lost my train of thought as to what story I was about to tell there. Oh yeah, I remember years prior to this event of him running away, I thought they were going to break up. Because I remember always wanting my mum and my dad to break up. Because, again, none of the mates that I had at school did have dads. So, like, this wasn't an abnormal thing. And I just remember thinking how much better my life would be if I didn't have a dad. And at one point, my mom found out my dad was cheating on her and took me in the middle of the night, stood me in front of her, knocked on this woman's front door to try to, like, guilt this woman. Opened the door, the woman answers, and my mom's like, look at what you've done to him. And I just remember, again, being a kid, sitting there like, oh, I don't actually care. I remember then, after she goes and puts me in the car so she can have an actual conversation with the woman, just thinking, God, I hope they don't get back together this time. But they did. And then years later, he runs away. But like other stories of things that the man did, I remember I have had 3 dogs through my childhood. The first one was a German Shepherd called Shep. Shep was brilliant. When I was about 6, 7 years old, Shep died. And he had a good life. There was no problems there. A couple of years before Shep died, we got a Jack Russell called Jack. They weren't exactly creative at naming their animals. Jack was mistreated very badly by everyone involved, pretty much. He never had a permanent home. At this point, before I was like... the first, 8 years of my life, we moved around a ton. I remember this pretty well. At 6 years old, I lived in Weston-super-Mare in a pub called the Whistling Duck that has since been knocked down, I learned. Also, by the way, 6 years old living in a pub when you've got an alcoholic father, brilliant idea there. Well done, guys. We ended up moving away because my dad was just drinking the reserves. I loved that time, though. Some of my fondest childhood memories were in that pub because my nan basically came with us. My sister, at the time when she only had one kid, came with us, even though they had their own mortgage. And it was pretty fun. I do remember having a lot of fun when we were in that pub because at the time, it was an opportunity for me to have some friends. Because think about it like this. Rather than my dad going out and getting drunk at the pub a few times a week and me not being able to have friends around because of what my home life is like, instead, my friends from that school would come over, their parents would go drinking because it's a pub, and I'd just get free access to pool, darts, and the pinball machine, and just because I'm the owner's son, or they were renting it or something. I don't really know how they afforded that, considering they didn't exactly have much money. Maybe they saved up. But anyway, it didn't exactly last very long because I think we were there no more than a year. And interestingly, when it comes to gaming stories, that was when I got my first handheld console. Because I've said this before, I have a habit of attributing life events to gaming memories. And I specifically remember that the year that I was at that pub, I turned 6 years old and I got my first Game Boy, which is that Game Boy back there. I still have it because I still have just about everything. But anyway, back to the Jack story. We had Jack before we moved into the pub, and Jack did not come with us to the pub. Jack went somewhere else. Where he went, I don't know. And then we came back, but for a while we didn't actually have anywhere to live because we had to basically emergency get out of the pub because my dad was an alcoholic. It was a bad idea. But my parents didn't exactly find us somewhere to live in the meantime because of that. Like, it's not like we moved out of the pub knowing we had another house to move into. So for a while we lived with my nan in Bentley, in that house that I visited a few months ago, if anybody remembers that video. And while we were there, Shep died, and Jack stayed with my sister. Because like I said, my sister and her husband and their first kid came with us to the pub, despite the fact they had their own mortgage at the time. They just continued paying the mortgage and just didn't live there. So they went back home when we left the pub, and they took Jack with them. And Jack was there for a while. And I don't know what caused it, but I think that they had problems with Jack and the neighbours, because Jack, being this dog that never really had a permanent home, wasn't well trained because nobody trained him. Jack barked a lot. He really did. He was a Jack Russell. He was badly trained. He was badly treated, and therefore he behaved badly. Shock, I know. It's like when people have got dogs that they mistreat and they wonder why it's not well behaved. Shocker. Anyway, I love Jack because I've always loved animals. Like, when I was in primary school, I wanted to work in a zoo. I went to animal care college. I wanted to work in a zoo. It was what I originally planned to do. It was my first, aspiration. It went out the window, but it was my first aspiration. But I always loved animals. Anyway, there was some sort of problem with Jack at my sister's house, being that the neighbours were complaining or something along those lines, and he was being too loud, or there was too many kids in the house, and Jack wasn't able to be trusted because he wasn't very well behaved. Because again, my sister started having a ton of kids. I think that one sister alone has got 6 kids. The other one's got 4. Yeah. No, she has 7 kids. Give me a second. Yeah, one sister has 7 kids, the other has 4. So there's 11 in total. she basically didn't stop spewing them out for a couple of years straight. Anyway, we had Jack back. And at this point, Jack was with us again. And I remember we were in my old house at this point, the one that I was in for like most of my childhood, the council house that my mum had to sell, the house that my mum had to sell and turn into a council house. The 2-bedroom house that I would avoid my dad in. We had Jack in that house. And one day we got a letter through the door of some neighbour complaining about the dog barking, but it was anonymous. And it really bothers me that it was anonymous, because it's like, that letter started a cascade of events that like broke me for a bit, and it was just one of the things that I hate my dad because of. One day in the middle of the night, I caught my dad trying to get rid of Jack. Now, so that you guys that are familiar with what I'm like know that I don't sleep at night very much. I'm very much so a night owl. I will get to bed at 4 in the morning and I get up at 12 in the afternoon. That's my sleep schedule. It's how it's been since I was a kid. I attribute it to the fact that every job I've had besides working at the school has been a job that works nights for the most part. Like when I worked at Tesco, it was primarily nights. As a kid, because of the fact that my dad was an alcoholic and always out in pubs and we'd have to go and find him, I was up all night quite often then with my mum trying to find where my dad had gone, but we'll get to more stories about that in a minute. I very quickly, as a kid, realised Christmas wasn't real because I would just catch my parents taking stuff down at night because, again, I didn't sleep at night. I stayed up all night even as a kid. But anyway, I caught my dad trying to get rid of Jack. Like, just straight up take him somewhere and leave him there. And I remember I got on the floor, I hugged Jack. Hang on. I got on the floor, I hugged Jack, and I begged my dad not to take him. I didn't win. That day, my dad told me that Jack was going to a farm. Google what that really means. There is a real decent chance that night they just left Jack on the side of a road somewhere. We'd had this dog 7 years by this point, I'm pretty sure. I think he was 7. And they just abandoned him, and I never saw him again. And then, when it comes to other stories that I can tell and be a bit less sad about, like I said, Wednesday was his drinking night. My dad had a big scar on top of his head because he was a pretty violent man. In my head, he was a very big man. He really wasn't, though, because I encountered him some years later, and I ended up significantly larger than him, which is quite funny. I'll try and throw up a picture. Like, this is how I ended up looking. When I describe my dad, I want you to imagine a 5'6", pretty overweight, chubby, EDL-looking bald man with tattoos neck to feet. Like, absolutely covered in tattoos, no hair, just your traditional, like, imagine bald football hooligan, beer drinking sort of geezer, you know? I've seen him have so many fights over the years. I've seen him get hurt. I've seen him bleed. I've seen him get so drunk he throws up. All this sort of thing. I saw him get bottled once. He's got a scar on the top of his head where he got bottled. There was this one time where he came home from drinking, and you know a shelf that sort of a floating shelf that you put in the corner of the room and it connects either side. He was drunk. He stumbled. He fell. He hit his head off that. He hit the deck. Like, he hit his head off this, and he hit it so hard that he just, like a sack of spuds on the floor. There was a puddle of blood behind his head, and he started having a fit. And I just remember I was sat on the stairs, and I remember that I was unfazed by this, because I was like, this is just my Wednesday. Every Wednesday this guy goes out drinking, and every Wednesday something happens. And I remember, because again, I associate events from my life with things. I remember the next day after that was sports day at school. And I went to school, did sports day like it was nothing. And I just remember thinking, I wonder what all the other kids' night was like last night. You know? We went to the hospital with him. He just sat there for a few hours and then checked himself out and all was, average. On another occasion, we went to pick him up from the pub. He wasn't there. One of his drinking buddies was like, oh, he left. Shortly after that, we realised he'd nicked somebody's car and he's gone to Cannock Chase. For those that don't know, Cannock Chase is this massive wooded area in the West Midlands. Apparently, according to his mate, he'd gone to end it all, as it were, because he'd had enough. From there, we call the police, and because it's Cannock Chase, they get a helicopter out and they try and find him. By the time they found him, they'd found him with a pipe attached to his exhaust, or the exhaust of the car that he'd nicked, and a pipe going through the front window. Because Google what happens after that. Basically, it's a method to yourself. And I just remember thinking even then that we'd probably be better off if he succeeded, which is a crazy thing to say when you think about it. But like, that was my life. There was another occasion, again, a little bit less depressing, I suppose, but still just things that stick with me. My mom has got decently bad teeth. She won't mind me saying that. She's had them fixed through dental work, but she had decently bad teeth. And when my dad ran away, I would listen to her on the phone crying every night to just about anyone that would listen, whether it be her work friends or my older sisters. And I'd hear her say things about my dad that I never knew, such as how he'd headbutted her and stuff like that, and that's why her teeth were so messed up. I did martial arts as a kid. I was always very obsessed with Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee and all that sort of thing, and so was my dad. And this is something that does bother me a little bit, like psychologically, is I really hate it when I have things in common with my dad because of what the sort of man he was like. I don't want anything in common with a guy like him. And whenever my mom would get angry at me as a teenager, because every teenager has fallouts with their parents, they just do. That's normal. That's not abnormal. And when that would happen, my mom would always say, "You're just like your dad." And you can imagine how deeply that cut me. So anytime I had anything in common with him or have had anything in common with him, it really bothers me. But something we did have in common was we both liked martial arts. Granted, he was never very good at them, but he just was a thug, you know. But from basically when I could walk until I was a teenager, I was put into martial arts. And anytime I put a foot wrong, he would attempt to, quote unquote, show me how to do it properly when we got home, if you can catch my drift there. He wasn't exactly capable of doing it properly himself, but it hurt. Whether he realised it or not. Because this is the thing, is I don't think he realises how bad all of this really was. Yeah. What other things happened? Oh yeah, the one in the house. So like, I was a pretty sickly kid for some reason. Probably just down to like malnutrition, because malnutrition through lack of nutritious food, I suppose, because I was fat, so it's not like I wasn't eating enough. But what I was eating was just ridiculous. I was being fed 2 litres of real Pepsi a day, and just like my mum and my dad, they didn't cook. They just fried stuff. They just put stuff in the oven. I remember I'd be handed a bowl of pasta with some ketchup, and that was it. Stuff like that pretty frequently. Anyway, so I was probably very nutrient deficient. I was a pretty ill kid. I had pneumonia when I was pretty young, and I had to go to the doctors quite a lot. I threw up a lot, to the point where I had like a sick bucket in my room just in case, just at all times. I don't know what was going on, but it was true. Anyway, because of that, I had time off school pretty frequently, and I ended up having enough time off school that I ended up getting in trouble with the amount of time off school I was having. And of course, apparently that was my fault, according to my dad. So this one time I was off sick and my dad was off work while I was off sick. And my mom told me, "Don't let your dad know that you're in the house. He needs to think you've gone to school." And logically, if I was me now, I'd have been like, hang on. We live in a 2-bedroom house with 1 bathroom, and the bathroom is attached to my room. How do you expect me to go hidden in this room? This is the sort of house that any movement anywhere in the house by anyone is audible. It is a tiny little house. This is impossible. But of course I tried. It meant that I couldn't have the telly on. I remember I just sat there under the covers on my Game Boy or my DS or something for 6 hours trying to hide. It didn't work because, of course, if he is at home and I'm supposed to be at school, at some point logically I've got to come back from school and come through that front door. And it's not like you can't hear the front door opening. So again, my mother just hadn't thought that through. But this is the sort of upbringing I had where I was like, just awful. So again, all these stories are to solidify why I did not care when my dad left. Something that my mom and my dad were never able to get through their heads is that I do not hate my father for how he left. Because that's life. People break up. Everybody I knew had divorced parents. I hated the bloke for what he was like when he was there. That's the difference. Now, again, I was just about to turn 13 when he ran away. And every few years after that, he would attempt to make contact. And it was never in a very particularly good way. I've only seen him in person once, and we'll get to that story. How do I go about this in logical order? So, This one time I was at college. So at college in the UK, I would have been 16 to 17. And I got a message on Facebook from his new wife, which, by the way, after my dad ran away, he ran away with... Okay, no. I've missed a few steps here. So, you remember the story of the time that my dad cheated and my mom took me to the house of the woman that he cheated on her with and stood me in front of her and knocked on the front door? That story. After that happened, my mom made him quit being a removals man and become a carer like she was at the same company that she worked at so that she could quote-unquote keep an eye on him. Granted, this did not go to plan either, because he didn't exactly change, because of course he didn't. And then when he did finally run away, he ran away with a woman that my mother and he worked with. So well done, that worked out just brilliantly, didn't it? And very quickly, he had 2 more children with her. Those children are now going to be something like... Because I'm 26 and this was half my life ago at this point. Them kids are going to be approaching their teenage years themselves. Them kids are going to be approaching the years that I was when he ran away. Anyway, I was getting messages from his new wife on Facebook on his behalf, talking about how apparently my dad was in really bad health. Have I not punished him enough by not allowing him contact with me? It's now or never that I see him. And I just remember thinking... I said this because at 16 I was pretty headstrong by this point. Because, I just was. I was like, I ain't got to give you nothing. If you're in bad health, whatever. Your problem. Your fault, likely. I don't need you. I've never needed you. None of that. You don't get to be making this ultimatum. You just don't. Imagine saying to your kid, now or never. Even if you'd had the perfect upbringing, your parents broke up and then that ultimatum was given, that makes you a dick. It just does. Let alone the upbringing I had. Of course I want nothing to do with you. Come on, be logical. Just the Jack story alone is enough for people to hate their father. But on that same conversation, she was like, what about the kids? Now, again, at 16 years old, I was smart enough and headstrong enough. I said, those kids, when they are old enough, can seek me out and they can get to know me if they want to. I will tell them the truth about what my life was like. I will not sugarcoat it. And they can make their own choice at that point whether they want to know me or not. I will not do what my older brother did to me. Because like I said earlier on, when my dad ran away, I found my older brother on Facebook from my dad's first marriage, and he told me to off myself, so I never had anything to do with him either. He was a dick as well. And I didn't want to do that to a 13-year-old that might one day find me. So I was like, when them kids are old enough, whenever they want to, then come and find me. I don't want anything to do with my dad, but when them kids are old enough that they can just be self-sufficient on their own, say when they're 16 and they want to know what's going on with their older brother, they can find me. Sure. Whatever. Of course, this didn't go over well either, and they were like, well, if you don't want anything to do with me or your dad, then you need nothing to do with them either. And I was like, I don't care either way. This is on them, and if they want to seek me out, whatever. I'm not fazed either way. Anyway, fast forward a few more years, I'm 20 or something like that at this point, and I'm working at Tesco. And it's weird, right? One of the big reasons that my dad said he left was because he hated the town that we live in, and my mother would never move with him. And it's why we moved around so much when I was a kid, is because he just didn't want to live here specifically. But I know that to this day of me being 26, he still lives in this town. I know he does. And I've only ever encountered him once. And it's interesting because I worked in retail for nearly 5 years, something like that. It would have been a calendar 5 years, but I didn't quite make it to my 5th year, I think. It was 2016 to 2021 when I quit. I was doing social media in 2020, and it got to a point in 2021 where I quit the retail job. And once, I was on self-scan in Tesco, and in walks my dad, his new wife, and his 2 children, who at the time, in 2020 maybe? 2021, I don't know. Call them 10 and 8. So yeah. And he spots me. And at this point, I'm livid. Say I'm in my 20s at this point. Hang on. I wanted to take him apart. I could have done easily. I remember looking at him now that I was a grown man. I remember looking at him thinking, how was I ever scared of you? 5'6", fat. He was nothing. I could that day have ripped him in half, no problem. The man that I was scared of as a kid was this little fat fella, Granted, it would have been very illegal, and I would have definitely lost my job. So I'm on self-scan, and he sees me, and he says, "Are you going to talk to me then?" And bearing in mind, "Are you going to talk to me then?" is the first words he's said to me since he left in person. This is the first time since he ran off that I've seen him in person, and that's what he says to me. And it's like, I just remember going, no. And I walk away. Because I'm like, if I don't walk away, who knows what I'll do. The other member of staff that was on self-scan with me was my best friend at the time. So he knew all about my dad, because all of my friends through life I've told these stories to, because I don't mind telling the stories, because while they're depressing, I recognise they are decently entertaining stories to listen to. You know, it's kind of interesting. So I've never been against telling these stories, because yeah, it's entertainment if nothing else. So my friend knew who he was, what he'd done, and what this meant. So I walked away, and over the headsets they're like telling the managers, being like, "Cayle's dad is here. He needs to go now." So my dad leaves. I come back out. They're like, "You all right?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine." A few hours go by. He comes back in, and he stands on the outside of self-scan. You know when you finish at Tesco and you finish self-scan, you leave and you walk out by the glass to the front door and exit the shop. And with his new 2 children, as a grown-ass man, when I'm also a grown-ass man, he gets on one knee to this 10 and 8-year-old. He points at me and he goes, "That is your older brother, and he does not give a shit about you." And then he walks off with his new 2 kids. That was the last I ever heard of him. That was a few years ago now. So that is the story of my dad. And yeah. So I don't know what I'm going to title this video, because the original question is, how did I get into gaming? And the answer is that gaming probably saved my life. I don't know what I'd have done if it wasn't for gaming. If I didn't have gaming, I'd have had nothing. Nothing at all. I would have just been barricaded in that prison of 4 walls, literally barricaded, because my dad would be so drunk that he wouldn't know which room the toilet was. Just dealing with that childhood, with that man. And yeah, so is it fair to say gaming saved my life? It probably is. It's why I will always love gaming, because gaming was able to provide me some of my favourite memories from a time where I didn't exactly accrue many of them. Here's another one. Here's another dad story that I've forgotten. In 2006, my mother had a heart attack. Because of course she did, because nothing about my childhood went smoothly. And when she had that heart attack, obviously she was in hospital for a while. She survived. But my whole family knew I could not be left alone with my dad in a house while my mum was in hospital. That just absolutely was not going to work. This was not a man that was capable of looking after a child. Who knows what would have happened. So what was going to happen was I was going to go stay with my nan. My most positive memories from my childhood all stem from my nan and the time that I spent with her in her old house in Bentley. Like, one weekend of every month, through my childhood, I'd spend a weekend there, and it was always the best weekend of every month, every single time. So the plan was, while my mum was in hospital, I was going to go stay with my nan, because staying with my dad was just not going to fly. So my sister takes me to my nan's and planned to leave me there while my mum was in hospital. And later that very evening, my dad turns up to collect me. And it's like, well, what am I going to do? I'm a kid, I've just got to go. So my dad tried to take me away and he succeeded, but my nan came with. So that week, my nan stayed in my house with me and my dad to make sure that I was going to be all right. There've been a few occasions like this through my life where I've been left alone. For example, when I was 15 or 16 or so after my dad had left, my mom went into hospital again for a surgery. She had some sort of surgery and it went bad, and one of her lungs collapsed while she was on the operating table. And basically, through all the complications of this surgery and all the things that happened, she spent a week in hospital then as well. And that week I was left alone in the house. And at 15, 16 years old, I was left alone for a week in the house. But at the time, my nan lived more local. In 2012, My nan sold her house in Bentley, which was the worst thing she ever did because it sold for £60,000. I could have bought that house today cash. Like, if she'd have just kept it, I could have bought it off her, you know? It would have been a good idea to keep that house in the family so that there's a paid off house in the family. Like, selling a house for 60k, like, by the time my nan died last year, there was nothing left of that 60k. It was all gone. So that it is, it was a pointless endeavor. She lived in that house. We all loved that house. It was paid off. The house had been there. She'd been in there 50 years or something like that. It was the house where I had my best memories. It was the house where my granddad and her lived their entire life until he died, and then like 10 more years later she moved out, or like 20 years later she moved out. It's where my sisters, who were in their 40s, all had their best memories because they went round as well. And then they sold that house in 2012 for just 60 grand, and they shouldn't have done that. Like, my nan needed to move closer to us because she was getting to an age where she couldn't be self-sufficient anymore. She needed people to look after her a little bit more. And us being where we are and her being where she was too far of a distance for us to be able to emergency run on over. So she sold that house and she moved into an old person's flat near my old house. It was about a 5-10 minute walk. So what would happen is I was on my own in the house for a week while my mum was in hospital. And if I needed anything, I could just walk across to my nan's. At the time, for pretty much the entire time that my nan lived near me, because my nan died at 94. So, okay, let's do the math on this. My nan died at 94, and that was in 2023. She sold the house in 2012. So she sold the house at 83 years old. So she moved to where we are at 83. So she was self-sufficient until she was 83. This was a hard to put down woman. Like, even in her late 80s, early 90s, she'd fall over all the time because she was a bit doddery. But she never actually broke, Anyway, it got to the point where she couldn't really live in that old house anymore because too many stairs, too big, too much to clean and all that sort of thing. So they had to sell it. But realistically, they should have just kept it because they did not need that 60 grand. She just didn't. My nan had her own pension, but which was pretty good because she worked for the council most of her life. And also my granddad's pension, which was pretty good because he was in the military. So she was always all right for money. That's why she was offering to solve any problem I had when I was a kid. So yeah, there was a week there where I kept going to... I'd go to my nan's if I needed anything because I was left on my own. I tell you what was always depressing is, in the later years of my nan's life, she was ready to die, and she'd tell us that. She was like, I'm done. She's like, all my grandkids are old and grown up now. Like, her first 2 grandkids are in their 40s with 11 children between them. She's seen 4 of them become 18 herself. She just wanted to make it to me being 18, and she made it to me being 25. So, like, by the time I was in my 20s, she was ready to go. She was like, she never remarried. She never spoke to another man after her husband died, and her husband died before I was even born. So if she died when I was 25, she spent 25 years alone, just waiting to go. And she was very, very Christian. So in her head, she was going to die and go back to be with my granddad. So in her head, she was ready to die. And she would just willy-nilly say that in conversations with us, and it always got very depressing. And anytime I would take a friend round or a partner or anything like that, she'd whip out these books of pictures, a photo album. And it'd be pictures of us at the old house and all the various different times that we'd had together. And she'd start crying. So yeah, to circle this back around to gaming, because that was the entire question, I realised that like the question was about what got me into gaming, and I could have just said I didn't have a very good childhood and I took solace in games and spent all my time gaming. I could have done this video in like 30 seconds and instead I turned it into a bit of a life story, but these sorts of videos tend to go over pretty well and I try and be as real as possible on this account. It's that every memory that I have from my childhood in some form or fashion, whether it be good or bad, whether it be all the bad stuff through my dad or all the good stuff through my nan, it's always tied back to gaming in some way. I can, for example, those weekends that I would go to spend with my nan, we would go into Walsall Town Centre, we'd go to Waterstone, she'd buy me some Yu-Gi-Oh cards. We would then go to Smith's or Game or wherever, and she'd always buy me a brand new game. And I can remember each and every time that happened. And now, when I stand at like my gaming shelves and I look at the games that I know she bought, and I'm like, my nan got me that. And then it's an opportunity for me to reminisce. And sometimes I even feel guilty for reminiscing. Like, sometimes I remember this is the thing, is I'm an incredibly nostalgic person, right? And I'm there nostalgic about good times. And I'm like, I didn't have that many good times because of the childhood I had. And it's like, should I be thinking this was good at all? It's like, yeah, there was some good times. Even more weirdly, and I hate this one with a passion, is there are some good times I have with my dad, you know? I've got photos of us at Alton Towers when I was a kid. Alton Towers to this day is still one of my favourite places, and it's his fault, and I feel bad about that, because I know that he was an awful man, and that I had an awful childhood because of him, but like not 100% of it was bad, you know? There was some percentage of it is good, because I say this on TikTok all the time, life isn't quite as binary as everything is always one way or the other. Even awful people can have their decent moments, you know? But, yeah. I don't know how long this video ran for, but I bet it's over half an hour. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Subscribe if you did. But between this video and the one I did the other day about how I managed to take myself from, like, financially being a failure at life to being alright, you've got basically my whole life story now. Nearly. I don't think there's much left.